Some people think loneliness comes from having nothing, but the quietest kind comes from having everything, and no one to share it with. Brian had paid that price for 40 years. Tonight, he'd driven past the glittering towers he owned, past the charity galas bearing his name, seeking something he couldn't name in a roadside diner held together by hope and habit. His watch, worth more than most people's cars, caught the flicker of cheap tinsel as he studied the empty chair across from him. Then came Carolyn Slater. She didn't rush to his table with forced cheer or rehearsed greetings. She simply appeared, coffee pot in hand, her movements carrying the particular grace of someone who'd learned to be invisible while serving the visible. But Brian saw her. He'd built an empire on reading people, the micro-expressions, the tells, the weaknesses. When her fingers steadied the cup she poured, he recognized it for what it was. Not trembling from fear, but from the bone-deep exhaustion of carrying more than one person should. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice low and knowing. For the first time in decades, Brian Carolan, the iceberg, the man who'd dismantled corporations with surgical precision, saw something he couldn't quantify or exploit. He saw someone standing in the same storm he'd been weathering alone, and the recognition cut through every defense he'd ever built. She was holding on by her fingertips, and somehow that made two of them. Some stories only survive if someone chooses to stay. If you're still listening, it means this one matters to you. And the only way it keeps going is if you choose not to walk away. Subscribe and stay with them. The warm glow of Christmas lights couldn't quite reach the corner booth where Brian Carolan sat, his tailored suit a monument to success in a room that celebrated survival. Loneliness costs nothing to acquire and everything to maintain. Brian had paid that price for 40 years. Tonight, he'd driven past the glittering towers he owned, past the charity galas bearing his name, seeking something he couldn't name in a roadside diner held together by hope and habit. His watch, worth more than most people's cars, caught the flicker of cheap tinsel as he studied the empty chair across from him. The silver-lining diner smelled of coffee that had been sitting too long and dreams deferred, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled perfection of his penthouse where even the air felt sterile. Then came Carolyn Slater. She didn't rush to his table with forced cheer or rehearsed greetings. She simply appeared, coffee pot in hand, her movements carrying the particular grace of someone who'd learned to be invisible while serving the visible. But Brian saw her. He'd built an empire on reading people, the micro-expressions, the tells, the weaknesses. When her fingers steadied the cup she poured, he recognized it for what it was, not trembling from fear, but from the bone-deep exhaustion of carrying more than one person should. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice low and knowing, warmer than it had any right to be at 11:30 on Christmas Eve. Brian looked up, caught off guard by the genuine question buried in routine words. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's had a few of her own. Carolyn set the pot down, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "I'm Carolyn. This is my last shift before the holiday, and honestly, I could use the company of someone who looks as tired of pretending as I am." Something in Brian's chest shifted, a sensation he hadn't felt in so long he'd forgotten its name. He gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Brian, and I think I'm exactly that tired." She slid into the booth with the sigh of someone finally taking off shoes that pinch. They called him the iceberg in boardrooms from New York to Singapore. The man who dismantled family businesses without flinching, who'd turned corporate bloodbaths into quarterly profits. But sitting across from Carolyn, watching her pour coffee that was bitter and slightly burnt, Brian felt more real than he had in any glass tower. "You picked an interesting place to spend Christmas Eve," Carolyn said, her eyes gentle but sharp enough to see past expensive fabric to empty spaces underneath. "I could say the same to you. Mine's not a choice. Yours looks like it is." Brian lifted the chipped mug, the ceramic warm against his palms in a way his crystal glassware never was. Sometimes the most expensive choices are the ones we make without realizing we're making them. I chose to win at everything, and somewhere along the way, I forgot to ask what winning cost. Carolyn studied him with the kind of attention that made Brian want to either run or confess. That sounds like something a very lonely man would say. It is. The admission surprised him, the ease of it, the relief. She reached across the table, not quite touching his hand, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. Well, tonight you're not alone. I'm here for another hour. And then I have to collect my daughter from the back room and figure out how we're going to make Christmas happen with what's left in my tips jar. Brian's jaw tightened. Your daughter's here? In the diner. Sophie. She's 8. My sitter canceled, and Miller, he's the manager, he doesn't know she's in the coat closet. If he finds out, I lose this job, and I can't afford to lose this job. For the first time in decades, Brian Carolan, the iceberg, the man who'd dismantled corporations with surgical precision, saw something he couldn't quantify or exploit. He saw someone standing in the same storm he'd been weathering alone, and the recognition cut through every defense he'd ever built. She was holding on by her fingertips, and somehow that made 2 of them. But what he didn't know was that in 60 seconds, everything was about to change. Because Miller had just walked in through the back door, and he'd heard every word. Carolyn's face went pale. Brian watched the color drain like water through a sieve, and he knew without turning that someone had entered the room behind him. But she recovered quickly, muscle memory from too many moments of having to smile through fear. She stood, smoothing her apron with hands that suddenly weren't steady at all. I should check on the kitchen, she said, her voice stripped of the warmth it had held seconds before. Brian's instinct, honed by decades of hostile negotiations, told him not to turn around. Never show your back in a room where power is shifting. But Carolyn wasn't in a boardroom. She was in a war zone, and the enemy wore a manager's badge and the particular cruelty of small authority wielded by small men. Instead of responding to the threat in the room, Brian did something unexpected. He stood, dropped 2 20s on the table for a $5 cup of coffee, and walked toward the restrooms. As he passed the kitchen door, he saw it. A flicker of light from the coat closet, warm and golden against the industrial gray. He paused, pretending to check his phone, and through the crack in the door he saw her. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, curled in a nest of coats that smelled like other people's lives. Reading a book so worn the spine had given up trying to hold itself together. Her flashlight, the cheap kind you get at a dollar store, cast shadows that made her look even smaller than she was. Sophie. Brian's throat closed. He knew this scene. He'd lived this scene. 42 years ago, he'd been the boy hiding in his mother's restaurant kitchen while she worked double shifts, reading by the light of an exit sign because books were the only place where people stayed when they promised they would. The memory hit him like a punch. He'd spent 4 decades learning not to feel. His father had left on a Tuesday. Brian remembered because it was raining, and his father had said he was just going to the store. That was the last Tuesday Brian had trusted anyone. He'd built his empire on that lesson. Trust no one. Need no one. Become so powerful that you could never be left because you'd be the one doing the leaving. The iceberg wasn't born. It was forged in the cold space his father left behind. But looking at Sophie, her small fingers gripping that book like it was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting, Brian felt the ice crack. This child shouldn't have to be invisible. This child shouldn't have to make herself small enough to fit in forgotten spaces. He returned to the booth, but Carolyn was gone. In her place stood a man who looked like he'd been pickled in resentment and bottom-shelf whiskey. Miller, the manager, the kind of man who measured his worth by how many people he could make feel smaller. She's been holding out on her tip share again, Miller said, loud enough for the only other customer, an old man nursing free refills, to hear. I'm tired of covering for her mistakes. Brian sat down slowly, his movements deliberate. In boardrooms, he'd learned that stillness was more intimidating than aggression. I don't believe we've met. We haven't. I'm the manager, and you're the guy who just tipped $40 on burnt coffee, which tells me you're either stupid or showing off. Miller's smile was all edges. Either way, you're done here. We're closing early. Where's Carolyn? That's not your concern. Brian's phone was already out, his fingers moving across the screen with the precision of someone who'd bought and sold companies between courses at dinner. Actually, it is. I'm about to make it everyone's concern. Miller leaned against the booth, trying to look casual and only managing to look cornered. Big shot, huh? Let me guess, you think you can save her. Buy her problems away. Well, her biggest problem is she brought that kid here again, and this time I caught her. Brian looked up from his phone, and his expression held all the warmth of January in Boston. Where is Sophie now? And that's when they both heard it. A crash from the kitchen, a child's cry, and Carolyn's voice, desperate and breaking, saying 3 words that would change everything. Please don't hurt her. Brian moved before Miller did, his chair scraping against linoleum as he stood. The kitchen door swung open, and there was Carolyn, her arm in Miller's grip, her face twisted in pain but her body angled protectively in front of the coat closet where Sophie was still hiding. The book she'd been reading lay splayed on the floor, its broken spine a small tragedy in a room full of larger ones. I told you, Miller hissed, his face flushed with the particular rage of a man whose authority is being questioned. No kids in the building. Health code. Liability. But you don't listen, do you, Slater? You never listen. She's 8 years old, Carolyn said, her voice shaking but her eyes steady. It's Christmas Eve. Where exactly was she supposed to go? Not my problem. Not my responsibility. Miller's grip tightened, and Brian saw Carolyn wince. You know what is my responsibility? This diner. These rules. And making sure employees like you don't cost me my license because you can't afford a babysitter. The old man at the counter had stopped pretending to read his newspaper. The cook had appeared in the kitchen window, his face carefully neutral in the way of people who'd learned not to intervene. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting for someone else to do something. Brian walked forward, not fast, not slow, just inevitable. Let her go. Miller looked at him like he was noticing an insect. This doesn't concern you, pal. Take your money and your fancy watch and get out of my diner. Your diner. Brian's voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that made boardrooms go silent. That's interesting. Because according to the county records I'm looking at right now, this diner's mortgage is held by Boston Commercial Bank, account number 7794216, and as of 3 minutes ago, I just purchased that debt. The room went still. Even the hum of the ancient refrigerator seemed to pause. Miller's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and then a sneer that didn't quite land. That's impossible. You can't just buy a mortgage on your phone. Brian pulled out his wallet, extracted a card so black it seemed to absorb light, and set it on the counter with the delicate precision of someone placing a chess piece. This is a Centurion card. It has no limit, and the man whose name is on the back of it has the Boston Commercial Bank CEO's personal cell phone number. Would you like me to call him so he can explain to you exactly how fast money moves when it wants to? For 60 seconds, no one breathed. Miller's grip on Carolyn loosened, not because he wanted to, but because his brain was trying to catch up with the math of how much power had just walked into his diner. You're bluffing, Miller said, but his voice had lost its edge. Brian's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then turned the screen toward Miller. It was an email from Boston Commercial Bank's executive office, confirming transfer of the mortgage on the Silver Lining Diner to Carolyn Ventures. Time-stamped 2 minutes ago. I don't bluff, Brian said. I calculate, and here's what I've calculated. This diner is mine. The debt you owe on this building is mine. And as of right now, you're fired. Miller's face went through several colors before settling on a mottled purple. You can't just fire me. I've been here 6 years. I have rights. You have 30 seconds to walk out that door before I call the police and have you charged with assault. Carolyn, did this man hurt you? Carolyn was staring at Brian like he'd just split the sea. Yes, my arm. That's all I need. Brian looked at Miller the way he'd looked at countless executives right before ending their careers. 20 seconds. Miller let go of Carolyn, backing toward the door, his face contorted with impotent rage. This isn't over. You think you can just walk in here and play hero? You don't know anything about this place, about these people. You're just some rich guy with a savior complex, and when you get bored, when you remember you have a real life to get back to, she'll still be here, broke, desperate, alone. He grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. You can't buy people. You can't fix people. And you definitely can't fix whatever's broken in you that made you think this was a good idea. The door slammed behind him, the bell above it jangling like broken teeth. In the silence that followed, Carolyn slowly sank into the nearest chair, her hand going to her arm where Miller's fingers had left red marks. The coat closet door creaked open, and Sophie emerged, her flashlight still clutched in one hand, her ruined book in the other. "Mama!" Her voice was so small. Carolyn opened her arms, and Sophie ran into them, and Brian watched them hold each other in the fluorescent light of a diner he now owned for reasons he was only beginning to understand. The cook cleared his throat. "So, are we still open, or?" Brian looked around the silver-lining diner, at the cracked vinyl and the coffee stains and the Christmas lights that blinked in patterns that had stopped being festive and started being desperate. He'd just bought a failing business with no plan, no exit strategy, and no logical reason. "We're open," he said. "Carolyn, take the rest of the night off. Paid." She looked up at him, tears on her cheeks, Sophie in her arms. "Why did you do that?" Brian didn't have an answer that made sense. So he told her the truth. "Because 40 years ago I was the kid in the closet. And no one came." But what he didn't say, what he was only now beginning to realize, was that saving Sophie and Carolyn might be the only way to save himself. And outside, in a car parked across the street, someone was taking pictures that would change everything. 20 minutes later, Brian found himself doing something he hadn't done in 15 years. He was helping someone close up a diner. Carolyn moved through the space with practiced efficiency, despite her shaking hands, wiping down tables, counting the register, switching off lights in a sequence that spoke of ritual. Sophie sat in the booth where Brian had been sitting, her damaged book open but her eyes on him, watchful and evaluating in the way only children can be. "You don't have to stay," Carolyn said for the third time, but her voice lacked conviction. She needed him to stay, not for the work, but because Miller's words still hung in the air like smoke, and she was afraid if Brian left, she'd wake up and find this had all been some exhaustion-induced hallucination. "I know," Brian said, stacking chairs. "Where do these go?" She showed him. They worked in comfortable silence, and Brian was struck by how much he'd missed physical labor, the simple equation of effort and result. In his world, nothing was simple. Every action had 17 consequences, 43 variables, and 89 possible outcomes. But a chair was either stacked or it wasn't. A floor was clean or dirty. The binary nature of it was almost restful. "I can't believe you bought a diner," Sophie said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. Brian looked at her. "Neither can I. Are you really rich?" "Sophie," Carolyn warned, but Brian held up a hand. "It's a fair question." He walked over to the booth, slid in across from Sophie. "Yes, I'm really rich." "Why?" "Because I worked very hard at the wrong things for a very long time." Sophie considered this with the seriousness of someone who'd learned to read between adult words. "Mama works hard. She's not rich." "No," Brian said quietly. "The system's not designed for people who work hard. It's designed for people who work smart. And even then, mostly it's designed for people who already have money to make more money. That's not fair." "No, it's not." Carolyn finished at the register, came over with her coat and Sophie's. "We should go. You've done enough. More than enough. More than..." Her voice cracked. "I don't know how to thank you." "Drive you home," Brian said, standing. "It's late. It's cold." Let me drive you home. Carolyn looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion won. She nodded. Brian's car was a Mercedes that cost more than 3 years of Carolyn's salary. Sophie gasped when she saw it, and Brian felt a complicated mix of pride and shame. The drive was quiet, punctuated by Sophie's navigation. Turn left here. No, the other left. Yes, that one. Until they pulled up in front of a building that was trying very hard not to be condemned. This is us, Carolyn said, her voice defensive. Brian looked at the building with its broken security door and flickering hallway lights. He thought about his penthouse with its 3 bedrooms he never used and its view of a city he'd stopped seeing. Can I walk you up? You don't need to. I know. Can I anyway? They climbed 3 flights because the elevator had a sign that said, out of order in permanent marker. The hallway smelled like cooking and old carpet and the particular sadness of dreams deferred. Carolyn's apartment was at the end. Door painted a cheerful yellow that fought hard against the gray around it. She unlocked it, flipped on the light, and Brian stepped into the smallest, warmest space he'd ever been in. It was 1 bedroom, he realized, maybe 500 square feet total. But Carolyn had turned it into a home. Christmas decorations made from paper and hope covered every surface. A tree that was more branch than pine sat in the corner, decorated with ornaments that looked handmade. Photos covered the walls, Sophie at every age, smiling despite everything. It's not much, Carolyn said. Brian walked to the tree, touched one of the ornaments. It was made from a popsicle stick and glitter, with Sophie age 5 written in marker on the back. It's everything, he said, and meant it. Sophie had already claimed the couch that apparently doubled as her bed, curling up with her broken book. Carolyn moved through the apartment, turning on lamps, offering coffee, nervously trying to be a hostess in a space that wasn't designed for guests. Carolyn, Brian said gently, sit down, please. She sat, perched on the edge of the couch next to Sophie. Brian took the only chair, an armchair that had been patched so many times it was more patch than chair. Why did you really do it? Carolyn asked. And don't tell me it's because you were the kid in the closet. Rich men don't buy diners on Christmas Eve because they feel nostalgic. Brian leaned forward, hands clasped. I don't know. I saw Sophie. I saw you. I saw Miller hurting you and I had the power to stop it, so I did. That's the most honest answer I have. What happens next? Her voice was small. Tomorrow? Next week. When you remember you have a life that doesn't include a failing diner and a waitress with more problems than solutions? I don't know that either. Brian looked around the apartment, at the sacred intimacy of it, the way every object told a story of love and sacrifice. His penthouse had 10,000 square feet and nothing in it that mattered. But I know that I sat in that booth tonight wanting to disappear, and you saw me anyway. So maybe what happens next is I try to return the favor. Carolyn's eyes filled with tears she was too proud to let fall. I can't be your charity case. You're not. You're the person who asked a stranger if he was having a rough night and actually wanted to know the answer. Brian stood. I should go. But Carolyn, the diner is real. The mortgage is real. Tomorrow, come in at whatever time works for you and Sophie. We'll figure out the rest. He moved toward the door, but Sophie's voice stopped him. Mr. Brian? He turned. Yes. My book broke. She held up the ruined paperback. It's my favorite, but the back fell off and some pages are missing. Brian walked back, knelt by the couch so he was eye level with her. What book? The Secret Garden. It's about a girl who finds a place that's been locked up and forgotten, and she makes it alive again. Something in Brian's chest tightened. That's a good book. I'll get you a new copy. Promise. Promise. Sophie smiled, satisfied, and closed her eyes. Brian left the apartment, walked down 3 flights of stairs, and got into his car worth more than the building he'd just left. He sat in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, and for the first time in 40 years, Brian Carolan cried. Not because he was sad, but because he'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed for something other than his net worth. He drove home to his empty penthouse, poured himself a scotch he didn't drink, and stood at the window watching the city glitter below him. Somewhere out there, Carolyn was putting Sophie to bed in an apartment held together by prayer. Somewhere out there, his brother Marcus was probably already hearing about the diner purchase through the network of gossip that connected Boston's elite. Somewhere out there, Brian's life was about to get very complicated. But for the first time in decades, complicated didn't feel like a problem. It felt like a promise. What he didn't know was that across town, Marcus was already making phone calls. And by morning, Brian's act of kindness would be front-page news, with a headline that would turn his moment of humanity into a weapon aimed directly at his heart. Brian's phone started ringing at 6 a.m. He ignored it. It rang again at 6:05 and 6:10. By 6:15, his phone had 17 missed calls, 42 text messages, and an email from his assistant with the subject line, "We have a situation." He made coffee in his sterile kitchen, watching the sunrise paint Boston in shades of gold and regret, and finally looked at his phone. The top message was from Marcus. Just 3 words, "Call me. Now." Brian didn't call. Instead, he opened his news app, and there it was. Front page of the Boston Herald's online edition. Billionaire's Christmas breakdown. Carolyn Ventures CEO buys diner, fires manager in bizarre midnight rampage. The photo was damning. Brian and Carolyn in the diner, his hand near her face in what the caption called an intimate gesture. Her face turned up to his in what could be read as something other than gratitude. Sophie was visible in the background, a child prop in a narrative about a rich man's midlife crisis. The article was worse. Anonymous sources, clearly Miller, painting Brian as unhinged. A man who'd walked into a diner, become obsessed with a waitress, and used his wealth to insert himself into her life. There were quotes from business associates expressing concern about Brian's judgment, questions about his fitness to lead Carolyn Ventures, speculation about the cost of the impulse purchase, and threaded through it all, carefully worded to avoid libel but clear in implication, was the suggestion that something inappropriate was happening between a billionaire and a desperate single mother. The article even mentioned Brian's estranged son, framing the diner incident as the act of a man seeking to replace the family he destroyed. Brian set the phone down, his hands steady despite the rage building in his chest. This had Marcus's fingerprints all over it. His brother had been waiting for an opening, a moment of vulnerability, and Brian had gift-wrapped it for him. The phone rang again. This time Brian answered. "You're up early," he said. Marcus's voice was smooth, concerned, the tone of someone practicing empathy like a foreign language. "Brian, I've been trying to reach you for an hour. Have you seen the news?" "I've seen it. This is bad. The board is already calling. They want an emergency meeting. They're concerned. They're concerned that you called them and told them to be concerned." Pause. Then Marcus dropped the pretense. "You bought a diner, Brian, in the middle of the night, on Christmas Eve. You assaulted a manager. I fired a man who was physically hurting an employee. That's not what it looks like. It looks like you've lost your mind. It looks like you're having some kind of breakdown, and the board needs to consider whether you're fit to make decisions for a company worth $8 billion. Brian walked to his window, looked out at the city his brother wanted to take from him. "When's the meeting?" "Tomorrow, Christmas Day. I know it's not ideal, but given the urgency. Of course it's Christmas Day. When else would you stage a coup? When I'm distracted. When I'm vulnerable. When you can frame concern as care." Brian's voice was cold, precise. "I'll be there. Brian, this doesn't have to be adversarial. We're brothers. I'm trying to help you." "No, Marcus, you're trying to help yourself. But here's what you don't understand. I don't care anymore." "What?" "I don't care about the company. I don't care about the board. I don't care about any of it the way I used to. So if you want Carolyn Ventures, If you want the empire we built on the grave of every relationship we ever sacrificed, you can have it. But you're going to have to take it. I'm not going to hand it over." Brian hung up. His hands were shaking now, not from fear but from adrenaline, from the unfamiliar sensation of not caring about the right things. He'd spent 40 years building his company, and in one night, a waitress and a little girl in a coat closet had shown him how hollow that foundation was. His phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it and his stomach dropped. It was a photo of him leaving Carolyn's apartment building at midnight with a caption, "What was he doing there so late?" And then another text, "This is just the beginning. Stop now or we release the rest." Brian stared at the phone, at the implicit threat, at the suggestion of impropriety where there was only exhaustion and kindness. Whoever Marcus had hired to follow him wasn't just documenting. They were building a narrative, and in the court of public opinion, truth mattered less than optics. He called Carolyn. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with fear. "Brian, I've been getting calls. Reporters. They're asking about you, about us, about..." She lowered her voice. "They're asking if Sophie is yours, if that's why you bought the diner. They're making it sound like something it's not." "I know. I'm sorry. This is my brother's doing." "Your brother? Why would your brother?" Understanding dawned in her voice. "Oh, the company. You have something he wants. I have everything he wants. And now he's using you to get it." Brian's jaw tightened. "Carolyn, I need you to trust me. This is going to get worse before it gets better. There are going to be more photos, more articles, more lies. And I understand if you want to walk away. I'll make sure you're taken care of. I'll set up a trust for Sophie. Brian," Carolyn interrupted, her voice suddenly firm. "Stop." He stopped. "You stood up to Miller when you didn't have to. You drove me home. You promised Sophie a book. You didn't do any of that because you wanted something from me. You did it because you're a decent man who forgot how to be decent. And last night you remembered." She took a breath. "So no, I'm not walking away. Whatever's coming, we'll face it. Together." The word "together" hit Brian like a physical thing. When was the last time someone had stood with him instead of behind him or against him? When was the last time together meant something other than a strategic alliance? "They're going to ruin you because of me," he said quietly. "They're going to try," Carolyn corrected. "There's a difference. Besides, I've been ruined before. I lost my husband, my savings, my career. I've been sleeping on a couch so my daughter can have the bedroom. They can't take anything from me I haven't already lost." Her voice softened. "But you, Brian, you have everything to lose. Your company, your reputation, I don't value the money anymore," Brian said, and realized he meant it. "I valued it for 40 years, and it bought me nothing but a bigger tomb to live in. Last night in your apartment, with your daughter asleep on the couch and those popsicle stick ornaments on that dying tree, I felt more alive than I have in decades. So let them come. Let Marcus stage his coup. Let the press write their stories. I finally found something worth fighting for, and it's not a stock price." Silence on the other end. Then Carolyn's voice, thick with emotion. "Be careful, Brian. Men like your brother don't fight fair. Neither do I. I just usually choose not to fight at all." He looked at his reflection in the window, at the man he'd become and the man he used to be. "But for you and Sophie, I'll burn my whole empire down if I have to." They talked for a few more minutes, making plans, preparing for the siege. When Brian hung up, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Not the empty purpose of quarterly earnings and market dominance, but the bone-deep certainty that what he was doing mattered to someone other than shareholders. He spent the rest of the day preparing. Not for the board meeting, that was theater and he knew his lines. No, he was preparing for war. And the first casualty, he decided, would be his own cowardice. But that evening, something happened that Brian didn't anticipate. Something that would change the trajectory of everything. Because while he was planning his defense, Sophie was in his library, and she just discovered a door that had been locked for a very long time. Behind that door were letters, hundreds of them, and Sophie, being 8 and curious and unable to resist a mystery, was about to do something that would either heal Brian's family or destroy what was left of it. The call from his head of security came at 9 p.m. "Sir, there's been a breach in the estate's east wing, the library room, but it's not an intruder. It's the child." Brian had brought Carolyn and Sophie to his estate that afternoon, after the third reporter had shown up at their apartment building and the landlord had threatened eviction over the media circus. His house had 52 rooms. They'd been using 3. Sophie had promised to stay in the guest suite, but apparently, curiosity in an 8-year-old girl was stronger than promises. He found her in his library, but not the main room with its leather chairs and first editions meant to impress business associates. Sophie had found the other room, the one behind the false bookcase, the one Brian hadn't entered in 3 years. She sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by letters, hundreds of them, some in envelopes, some just folded paper, all of them addressed to Leo Carolan, none of them mailed. "Sophie," Brian said, his voice carefully neutral despite his heart hammering, "you shouldn't be in here." She looked up at him with eyes that saw too much. "You have a son." "I did. I do. It's complicated. These are letters to him. You wrote them but never sent them." She held one up. "This one is from 12 years ago. It says, 'Dear Leo, today is your birthday and I'm sitting in a hotel room in Singapore instead of at your party because I chose a merger over a cake. I'm sorry.'" Sophie's voice was matter-of-fact, reading like she was reciting a grocery list, which somehow made it worse. "You read them?" Brian's voice came out sharper than intended. "I read one, but there are so many." She gestured at the floor, at the evidence of a decade of cowardice. "Why didn't you send them?" Brian walked into the room, careful not to step on the letters, the paper ghosts of a relationship he'd murdered with neglect. "Because saying sorry on paper is easier than saying it to someone's face. Because I was afraid. Because by the time I had the words, it was too late." "It's not too late." Sophie stood, clutching a letter. "My friend Emma's dad left when she was 4. He came back when she was 7. It was hard, but they talk now. 3 years, Mr. Brian. He was gone 3 years and they fixed it." "How long has it been since you saw Leo?" 14 years. Sophie's face crumpled. "That's longer than I've been alive." "I know. That's too long." "I know that too." Brian sat down among the letters, his expensive suit collecting dust from years of neglect. "His mother and I divorced when Leo was 4. I chose work over custody, over visits, over birthdays and school plays and all the moments that make a father. By the time I realized what I'd lost, he was 18 and had changed his number. I hired investigators to find him, but he didn't want to be found. These letters." He picked one up, his own handwriting mocking him with its neat precision. "These letters were my way of pretending I was still trying while making sure I'd never have to face his rejection." Sophie sat back down next to him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Do you love him?" "More than anything." "Then you have to send them. All of them." Sophie started gathering letters, her small hands working with determined efficiency. "My teacher says that love without action is just a feeling, and feelings don't count if you don't do something about them." "Sophie, I can't just." "Why not?" She looked at him with the brutal honesty only children possess. "Are you scared he'll say no? Because he already said no by not talking to you. So the worst thing that can happen already happened. But if you send these, maybe something changes. Maybe he reads one and remembers that you're his dad. Maybe he doesn't. But at least you tried for real instead of pretend trying." Brian looked at this 8-year-old girl who'd been reading by flashlight in a coat closet 12 hours ago, now lecturing him about courage in his own home. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I just know what it's like to want your dad and not have him. Mine died when I was 5. Car accident. I'd give anything for letters from him, even ones he was too scared to send. Her eyes filled with tears. You have a son who's alive, and you're wasting it because you're afraid. That's dumb. The word hung in the air, simple and devastating. Dumb. 40 years of business strategy, of calculated risks and measured responses, and an 8-year-old had just called his greatest failure exactly what it was. Dumb. You're right, Brian said quietly. It is dumb. So fix it. Sophie handed him a stack of letters. Send them. I don't know where he lives. Then find out. You're a billionaire. You found my mom's mortgage in 3 minutes. You can find your son. Brian laughed. A sound that was half amusement, half despair. You make it sound simple. It is simple. You're just making it complicated because complicated means you don't have to do anything. Sophie stood, brushed dust off her pajamas decorated with stars. I'm going to help you. Sophie. Nope. You helped my mom. I'm helping you. That's how this works. She picked up more letters, started organizing them by date. We'll mail one every day. That way he gets them in order like a story. And if he doesn't respond to the first 10, we'll know to stop. But if he does respond, even just to tell you to stop, at least you'll be talking. From the doorway, Carolyn's voice. Sophie Marie Slater. What did I say about exploring? Sophie froze, guilt written across her face. But Brian stood, positioning himself between Sophie and whatever consequences were coming. It's my fault. I should have locked the door. Carolyn entered the room, took in the scene. The letters, the dust, her daughter trying to fix a broken man's broken family. Her expression softened from anger to understanding. Brian, I'm sorry. She shouldn't have invaded your privacy. She's right though. Brian looked at the letters years of cowardice made tangible. I need to send them. I need to try. Carolyn walked further into the room, picked up a letter, read the first line. Dear Leo, I missed your graduation today because I had a conference call that could have waited. I will regret this for the rest of my life. She looked up at Brian, her eyes wet. These are beautiful and heartbreaking, and you absolutely need to send them. What if he doesn't want them? Then at least you'll know you tried. Carolyn set the letter down gently, like it was something sacred. But Brian, Sophie's right. You can't send them all at once. It's too much. One at a time. Let him process. Let him decide. Brian nodded, feeling something loosen in his chest. For 14 years, these letters had been his secret, his shame, his proof that he was too broken to deserve forgiveness. But standing here with Carolyn and Sophie, surrounded by evidence of his failure, he felt something unexpected. Hope. Okay, he said. We'll send them, but I need to find him first. I can help with that, Carolyn said. I'm good at finding people who don't want to be found. You learn that skill when you're trying to track down late child support payments. They worked for the next hour, organizing letters, searching social media, calling in favors. Brian's investigators had found Leo 3 years ago, but reported he'd asked not to be contacted. Now Brian was breaking that promise, but some promises, he realized, needed to be broken. They found him at midnight. Leo Carolan, age 22, living in Providence, Rhode Island, working as a teacher at an inner-city elementary school. There were photos on his school's website. A young man with Brian's eyes and his mother's smile, surrounded by children who looked like they'd been given the attention Brian had never given his son. He's a teacher, Brian whispered, staring at the photo. He's exactly what you should have been, Carolyn said gently. Present. Sophie had fallen asleep on the library couch, one of Brian's unmailed letters clutched to her chest like a teddy bear. Brian covered her with his jacket, then sat at the desk and wrote one more letter. Not an explanation or an apology, just an introduction. Dear Leo, I know I have no right to contact you after 14 years of silence. I know these letters will seem like too little, too late. But your grandmother used to say that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. I'm planting this tree now, knowing it may never grow, but hoping that someday you might sit in its shade and remember that I tried. The first letter is enclosed. There are more if you want them. If not, I understand. I love you. I've always loved you. That was never the problem. The problem was I didn't know how to show it. I'm learning now. Dad. He sealed the envelope, addressed it to the school since he didn't have a home address, and set it aside. Tomorrow he'd mail it. Tomorrow he'd face Marcus and the board. Tomorrow the war would begin in earnest. But tonight he had Carolyn making tea in his kitchen and Sophie asleep in his library, and somewhere in Providence, his son was alive and teaching children and maybe, just maybe, willing to read a letter from a father who'd finally learned what mattered. She mailed them already? Carolyn said from the doorway, holding her phone. Brian looked up. What? Sophie. While we were searching for Leo, she took a stack of letters and went to your front gate. Your security guard says she handed him 12 envelopes and asked him to mail them first thing tomorrow. They're already in the outgoing mail. Brian's heart stopped. Which 12? Carolyn checked her phone. The first 12 chronologically. The ones from right after the divorce. The rawest ones. For a moment, Brian couldn't breathe. Those letters were wounds without bandages, pain without context. Leo would receive them over the next 2 weeks, one each day, a chronicle of every mistake Brian had made. She's 8, Carolyn said. She didn't understand the implications. I can call the guard, have him pull them back. No. Brian stood, walked to the window, looked out at the city lights. No, let them go. Maybe raw is what I need. Maybe pretty words and careful apologies are just more cowardice. Let him see the damage. Let him decide if it's fixable. Behind him, Carolyn was quiet. Then she crossed the room and stood next to him. You're braver than you think. I'm terrified. That's what brave means. Doing it anyway. She touched his hand, just her fingers against his. Tomorrow is going to be hard. Marcus is coming with everything he has. Are you ready? Brian thought about his son receiving letters written in the dark hours of regret. He thought about Sophie asleep in his library and Carolyn standing beside him. He thought about the diner he'd bought on impulse and the life he'd led on autopilot. No, he said honestly, but I'm going anyway. What neither of them knew was that Leo had already received the first letter. The school's mail came early, and the secretary had placed it on his desk before dawn. Leo was holding it now, staring at his father's handwriting for the first time in 14 years, trying to decide if some doors should stay locked forever or if, maybe, just maybe, it was time to turn the key. And his answer would arrive on New Year's Eve, at a diner that smelled of coffee and second chances, and it would change everything. Christmas Day dawned cold and clear, the kind of morning that makes everything look sharp and unforgiving. Brian dressed in the uniform of his old life. Tom Ford suit, Hermes tie, watch worth more than most cars. Armor. He looked in the mirror and saw the iceberg staring back. But now he knew what was beneath the surface. Carolyn had insisted on coming. You're not walking into that alone, she'd said over coffee at 5 a.m., both of them too anxious to sleep. Sophie was still asleep upstairs, dreaming of whatever 8-year-olds dream of, blissfully unaware that today Brian would either save his empire or burn it down. The Carolyn Ventures headquarters building was dark except for the 43rd floor, where the boardroom blazed with light. Christmas Day. Marcus had chosen well. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The day of family and redemption, twisted into a corporate execution. Brian's phone had been buzzing all morning. Board members, lawyers, business partners, all pretending concern while positioning themselves for whatever came next. He'd ignored them all except one message from his assistant. Marcus has 7 votes. You have 4. The rest are undecided. He's going to move for emergency removal, claim mental incompetence. He has evidence. Evidence. Brian could guess what that meant. The photos, The diner purchase. Testimony from Miller painting him as unhinged. Maybe even medical experts willing to speculate about Brian's mental state for the right price. Marcus had been thorough. The elevator opened onto the 43rd floor. Through the glass walls of the boardroom, Brian could see them. 13 board members, Marcus at the head of the table where Brian usually sat, everyone in their Christmas finest, here to witness a coup disguised as intervention. Carolyn squeezed his hand. "You sure about this?" "No, but thank you for being here. Where else would I be?" She smiled, but her eyes were worried. "Go show them who you really are." Brian walked into the boardroom alone. The conversation stopped. 13 faces turned toward him, expressions ranging from sympathy to anticipation to barely disguised glee. Marcus stood at the far end, his smile warm and fraternal and absolutely poisonous. "Brian, thank you for coming. I know this is difficult, but we're all here because we care about you and the company." Brian took his seat, not at the head where Marcus was standing, but in the middle, equal among equals. "Let's skip the performance, Marcus. You called this meeting to remove me, so remove me. Vote." Marcus's smile tightened. "This isn't about removal. It's about concern. Brian, in the last 48 hours, you've exhibited behavior that has the entire board worried. The diner purchase, the altercation with an employee, the woman. Her name is Carolyn. Fine, Carolyn. You've been photographed entering her apartment at midnight. You've moved her and her child into your home. You've made substantial financial decisions without board approval. And according to multiple witnesses, you've been emotionally volatile." Marcus gestured to a folder. "We have statements from colleagues, psychological evaluations, media reports. Brian, no one is questioning your past contributions, but we have a fiduciary duty to protect this company. And right now, your judgment is compromised." "Compromised how?" Brian's voice was calm, clinical. "Be specific." Marcus opened the folder. 3 days ago, you purchased a failing restaurant with no strategic value for $230,000. You did this via a phone call with no due diligence, no financial analysis, no board consultation. That's not sound business practice. That's impulsive. "It was impulsive," Brian agreed. "It was also the right thing to do. Business isn't about right and wrong. It's about profit." "That's exactly the problem." Brian stood, walked to the window. Boston spread below him, and for the first time, he saw it as more than territory to conquer. He saw people in those buildings. Carolyn's and Sophie's working multiple jobs, reading by flashlight, trying to survive in a system designed to keep them small. "I built this company on that principle. Profit above everything. And it made me rich and miserable and alone. So yes, Marcus, I bought a diner. I fired a man who was hurting someone I care about. I brought 2 people into my home who needed safety. And I'd do it again." Board member Jenkins cleared his throat. "Brian, no one is questioning your personal choices. But this is a publicly traded company. Your actions affect thousands of employees, millions of shareholders. We can't operate on emotion." "Why not?" Brian turned back to the room. "We've been operating on greed for 40 years. That's an emotion. Why is greed acceptable but compassion isn't?" Silence. The question hung in the air, unanswerable because it was true. Marcus's jaw tightened. "This is exactly what I'm talking about." Brian has lost perspective. He's prioritizing strangers over stakeholders, feelings over finances. And gentlemen, ladies, we have evidence that this goes deeper. He pulled out another document. 3 weeks ago, Brian canceled a $30 million acquisition because, and I quote, "The founder reminded him of his father. That's not business strategy. That's unresolved trauma affecting major decisions." The founder was being forced out of his own company by his children, Brian said quietly. Children he'd raised, who he'd given everything to, who were staging a hostile takeover while he was recovering from a heart attack. Yes, it reminded me of my father. It reminded me that I've become the kind of person my father warned me about. So I canceled the deal. And I'd do it again. That deal cost us millions in potential profit. It saved a man's legacy. That's worth more. Marcus slammed his hand on the table. This is insanity. You're talking like a social worker, not a CEO. Brian, I love you. You're my brother. But you've had a breakdown. These board members care about you. We all do. But we also have a responsibility to this company. So I'm calling for a vote. Not to remove you, but to place you on temporary leave. 60 days. During that time, you'll receive the help you need, and I'll act as interim CEO. When you're better, when you've regained perspective, you can return. But right now, you're not fit to lead. The room shifted. Board members glanced at each other, calculating. Marcus had framed it perfectly. Not an attack, but an intervention. Not cruelty, but care. Brian could see the votes aligning, 7 becoming 8, 8 becoming 9. In 60 seconds, he'd lose everything he'd built. Before you vote, Brian said, his voice cutting through the murmurs, I have something to share. He pulled out his phone, connected it to the boardroom display. A video filled the screen. Marcus, in his office, talking to someone off camera. The audio was clear. Brian's becoming a liability. He's too cautious, too ethical. The Cambodia deal, he won't approve it because of labor concerns. Marcus's voice dripped with contempt. Labor concerns. Since when do we care about labor concerns? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to wait for him to make a mistake, document it, and use it to force him out. And if he doesn't make a mistake, we'll create one. The room went silent. On screen, Marcus continued, the diner thing is perfect. We leak it, frame it as a breakdown, get him removed. Once I'm CEO, we push the Cambodia deal through. 700 million in profit. Who cares if their workers are children? Brian stopped the video. This was recorded 6 weeks ago by my assistant, who you tried to bribe into spying on me, Marcus. She declined and came to me instead. So yes, I've been making different choices lately, but not because I'm broken, because I finally realized what we've become. What I've become. Marcus's face had gone pale. That's out of context. You were just planning to overthrow your brother and profit from child labor. That's not out of context. That's exactly the context. Brian faced the board. So vote. Vote to remove me. Vote to make Marcus CEO. But know that if you do, I'm taking this recording to the SEC, to the press, to anyone who'll listen. And I'm resigning not because I'm incompetent, but because I refuse to be part of a company that values profit over people. The silence was absolute. Jenkins spoke first. Brian, what are you saying? I'm saying I quit. The words felt like freedom. Effective immediately. I'm resigning as CEO. Not because Marcus forced me out, but because I choose to. I've spent 40 years building this company, and I just realized I built it on sand. So you can have it. All of you. But I'm not going quietly, and I'm not letting Marcus profit from my exit. He pulled out another document, handed copies to each board member. This is my resignation letter. It's also an announcement that I'm placing my entire 62% controlling stake in Carolyn Ventures into a charitable trust. The trust will vote my shares, which means Marcus, you don't get control. The trust does. And the trust's mandate is simple. Operate profitably, but ethically. No child labor. No environmental destruction. No putting earnings over human dignity. Marcus lunged to his feet. You can't do that. Those shares are worth billions. They're my billions. And I just did. Brian looked at his brother, at the rage and disbelief warring on his face. You were right, Marcus. I did have a breakdown, but not the kind you think. I broke down the walls I built to keep people out. I broke down the belief that money equals worth. I broke down the idea that success means dying alone in a golden tower. So thank you for the photos, the leaks, the coup attempt. You freed me. He turned to the board. I'll be available for transition planning. But I'm done. I'm going home. He paused at the door. Actually, I'm not. I'm going to a diner to help a woman who works 3 times harder than anyone in this room for a fraction of the pay. And then I'm going to try to rebuild a relationship with my son, who I haven't spoken to in 14 years because I chose meetings like this over his childhood. So goodbye. And Merry Christmas. Brian walked out of Carolyn Ventures for the last time. In the elevator, his hands started shaking. Not from fear, but from relief. 40 years of climbing, and the fall felt like flying. Carolyn was waiting in the lobby. She saw his face and knew immediately. You did it. I did it. Quit. I'm broke. Well, not broke, but trust fund broke, which is basically the same thing in my world. He laughed, and it sounded slightly unhinged even to him. I just gave away $8 billion, and I feel amazing. She hugged him. Right there in the corporate lobby with its marble floors and fresh flowers and everything that had never made him happy. I'm proud of you. I'm unemployed. I'm probably going to be sued. My brother will never speak to me again. But you're free. Carolyn pulled back, looked at him. You're finally free. They walked out into the Christmas morning, and Brian felt lighter than he had in decades. He'd lost his company, his fortune, his legacy. But somewhere in Providence, his son was reading a letter. Somewhere in his library, a little girl had mailed forgiveness disguised as envelopes. And standing next to him, a woman who'd served him coffee and accidentally saved his life. Where to? Carolyn asked. The diner. Let's open it. Let's serve Christmas dinner to anyone who shows up. Free. Because we can and because someone should. They did exactly that. By evening, the Silver Lining Diner was packed with people who had nowhere else to go, and Brian Carolan, former billionaire, served coffee and pie with the same precision he'd once used to dismantle companies. And for the first time in 40 years, when he looked at the empty seat, it wasn't empty anymore. But that night, when they locked up the diner and drove home through streets decorated with lights and hope, Brian's phone rang. Unknown number. Providence area code. And when he answered, a voice he hadn't heard in 14 years said 3 words that would change everything again. I got your letters. New Year's Eve arrived cold and clear. The kind of night where every breath feels like a promise and every ending suggests a beginning. The Silver Lining Diner had transformed over the past week. Brian had hired back every employee Miller had terrorized, raised their wages, and somehow word had spread. The place was packed every night now, not because the food had improved, but because people wanted to eat somewhere that felt like hope. Carolyn was managing the diner, her natural warmth and unshakable dignity turning customers into regulars. Sophie had her own corner booth, homework spread across the table, occasionally helping bus tables when the dinner rush hit. And Brian, who'd once commanded boardrooms and moved markets, now made coffee and learned the complicated art of remembering how people liked their eggs. But tonight was different. Tonight, Leo was coming. The phone call on Christmas had been brief, painful, and necessary. I got your letters, Leo had said, his voice careful and controlled. All 12 of them. I don't know what to do with them. You don't have to do anything, Brian had replied, his heart hammering. I just needed you to know I was thinking about you. That I've always been thinking about you. That doesn't make it better. Thinking about someone and being there for them are different things. I know. Silence. Then, there are more letters? Sophie mailed 12, but you said there were more. Hundreds. Another pause, longer. I don't want them all at once. It's too much. But maybe one more. Maybe we start there. They'd agreed to meet tonight, New Year's Eve, neutral ground. Leo had chosen the diner after Brian mentioned where he was working. I want to see what was worth losing your company over, Leo had said, and Brian couldn't tell if that was curiosity or judgment. Now, at 11:30, Brian wiped down the counter for the 15th time, his hands needing something to do. The diner was decorated for New Year's, silver streamers and balloons that Sophie had insisted on, making the space feel simultaneously festive and fragile. "He'll come," Carolyn said, refilling the coffee station. She'd become adept at reading Brian's anxiety, translating his silences into their root causes. "And if he doesn't, that's okay too. You still tried." "What if trying isn't enough?" "Then it isn't. But at least you'll know." She touched his arm. "Brian, you can't control his response. You can only control your actions. And your actions have been brave. That matters." Sophie looked up from her homework. "Is Leo nice?" "I don't know," Brian admitted. "I knew him when he was 4. He liked dinosaurs and refused to eat anything green. But that was a long time ago. People change." "You changed," Sophie said with the simple logic of childhood. "Maybe he did too." At 11:45, the door opened. A young man stepped in and Brian's breath caught. Leo, taller than expected, broader through the shoulders, but with the same eyes Brian saw in the mirror every morning. He wore jeans and a teacher's cardigan, and he carried a messenger bag like armor. They looked at each other across the diner, and the years stretched between them like a chasm that couldn't be bridged with words alone. Leo spoke first. "You look older. You look like your mother. Is that good or bad?" "It's perfect." Brian stayed behind the counter, giving Leo space, giving both of them room to retreat if this went wrong. "Thank you for coming." Leo walked further in, his eyes scanning the diner, taking in the cracked vinyl and the hopeful decorations and the woman behind the register who was pretending not to watch. "So this is it. The diner that broke the internet. The scene of the Billionaire's breakdown. It's just a diner." "No, it's not." Leo approached the counter, set his bag down. "I read the articles. All of them. You bought this place to fire a man who was hurting someone. You gave up your company to protect what exactly? Your pride? Your reputation? Neither. I gave it up because I finally understood the cost of keeping it." Brian poured coffee without being asked, set the cup in front of his son. "Your letters helped with that." "My letters? I didn't send letters. You sent letters." "You're right. I'm sorry. Your absence helped with that. 14 years of knowing I'd broken something irreplaceable. And then a little girl reading by flashlight in a coat closet reminded me of myself, and I couldn't ignore it anymore." Leo picked up the coffee, didn't drink it. "You want credit for helping strangers because you felt guilty about abandoning me?" The words hit like fists, but Brian didn't flinch. "No, I don't want credit. I want to apologize. And I want to explain, not to excuse, but so you understand. When your mother and I divorced, I was drowning. My business was failing, my marriage was over, and every time I looked at you, I saw my own father, the one who left, and I was terrified I'd do the same damage he did, so I did worse. I left while staying physically present. I gave you money instead of time, security instead of love, and by the time I realized what I'd done, you were grown and gone, and I'd become exactly what I feared." Leo's hands tightened around the cup. "Those letters, the early ones, they were painful to read. You were so lost. I still am. But I'm trying to find my way back." "Back to what? Me?" "Dad, you can't just write letters for 14 years and show up expecting forgiveness. That's not how this works." "I know. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything except maybe 5 minutes of your time to say I'm sorry. To say I love you. To say that not being your father is the biggest failure of my life, and no amount of money or success ever made up for it." Across the diner, Sophie had been watching with the intensity children bring to moments they don't fully understand but know are important. She slid out of her booth, grabbed something from her backpack, and walked over before Carolyn could stop her. "Hi," she said to Leo. "I'm Sophie. I'm the one who mailed the letters." Leo looked down at her, surprise softening his expression. "You mailed them? 12 of them? Mr. Brian wrote them, but he was too scared to send them, so I did it for him. Because my dad died and I'd give anything for letters from him, even ones he was scared to send. She held up a book, weathered but newly repaired, its spine reinforced with careful tape. Mr. Brian said you liked dinosaurs when you were little. This is my favorite book about dinosaurs. He was gonna give it to you a long time ago, but he never did, so I'm giving it to you now. Because he should have but didn't, and somebody should. She thrust the book at Leo, then ran back to Carolyn, hiding behind her like she'd just done something dangerous. Leo stared at the book. It was old, a children's encyclopedia of prehistoric life, the kind he'd loved when he was small. His hands shook as he opened it, and there, on the inside cover, was an inscription in Brian's handwriting. For Leo, age 5, may you always stay curious. Love, Dad. I bought that for your 5th birthday, Brian said quietly. I was traveling. I meant to give it to you when I got back. I never did. It sat in my office for 17 years until Sophie found it. Leo's jaw worked, emotion fighting with control. You kept it. I kept everything. Every birthday present I never gave. Every Christmas gift I meant to send. Every reminder of every moment I missed. My library is full of them. Shrines to my failures. That's pathetic, Leo said, but his voice broke. Yes, it is. They stood there, father and son, separated by a diner counter and 14 years of silence. Around them, the last customers of the decade counted down the seconds to midnight. 10, 9, 8. I don't forgive you, Leo said. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I understand. But I read the letters, all 12, and I want to read more. Not all at once. I can't handle that. But maybe one a month. Maybe we start there. 7, 6, 5. I'll send them. One a month. For as long as you want them. And maybe coffee. Once every few months. Here. At this diner. Neutral territory. 4, 3, 2. I'd like that. 1. The diner erupted in cheers. Happy New Year. Auld Lang Syne played on the old jukebox. Strangers hugged strangers. Carolyn wiped tears from her face. Sophie blew a noisemaker. And Brian reached across the counter, not quite touching his son's hand, just close enough to feel the warmth. Happy New Year, Leo. Leo's fingers moved, closed the distance. For just a second, they held on. Happy New Year, Dad. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't healing. But it was a bridge, fragile and new, spanning the gap between what was broken and what might be. And sometimes that's all you need. Place to start. Leo stayed for an hour. They talked carefully about his teaching, about the diner, about anything except the 14 years they were both thinking about. Sophie showed him her homework and Carolyn made him pie, and by the time he left, something had shifted. Same time next month? Leo asked at the door. I'll be here. And send the next letter. The 13th one. I will. Leo paused, hand on the door. Brian. Yes. Thank you for finally trying, even if it took you 40 years. He left, and Brian stood in the doorway watching his son disappear into the new year. Carolyn came up beside him, Sophie in her arms, half asleep but fighting it. You did good, Carolyn whispered. I did the bare minimum. Sometimes that's enough to start. They closed the diner together, turned off the lights, locked the door on 1 year and whatever came next. And as they drove home through streets loud with celebration, Brian realized he wasn't alone anymore. He had a son who might, maybe, someday forgive him. He had a little girl who'd taught him about courage. And he had a woman who'd seen him at his worst and his best and chosen to stay for both. The mansion he'd lived in alone for 15 years was now full. Sophie's laughter echoed in hallways that had known only silence. Carolyn's coffee-filled rooms that had been sterile. And somewhere in his library, hundreds of letters waited to become the map that led him home. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but for the first time it was a life worth living. Spring came to Boston like a promise kept. The snow melted into memory. The trees remembered their purpose, and the world turned green with forgiveness. It was April now, for months since Christmas Eve, and the man who'd sat alone in a diner booth was unrecognizable in all the ways that mattered. Brian stood in what used to be the barren east lawn of his estate, watching contractors put finishing touches on a garden that shouldn't exist. Not a showpiece garden meant to impress business associates, but a real garden. Reading nooks hidden in arbors, paths that led nowhere important and everywhere that mattered. And at the center, a glass greenhouse where Sophie could read no matter the weather, light streaming through panels that made even rainy days feel like sunshine. "She's going to lose her mind," Carolyn said, coming up beside him with 2 cups of coffee. They developed this rhythm: morning coffee before the chaos of the day, stolen moments of quiet before Sophie woke, and the diner opened and life resumed its beautiful, messy momentum. "That's the plan." Brian took the cup, their fingers brushing in the exchange, a gesture so natural now it didn't require acknowledgement. "I wanted to give her a place that was hers. No closets, no flashlights, no hiding. You've given her so much more than that." Carolyn leaned against him slightly, a permission they'd granted each other over winter. Not romance, not exactly, but something deeper. Partnership. Family. "You've shown her that the world can be kind. You showed me that first." From the house, Sophie's voice. "Are you guys having secret meetings without me again?" She burst through the French doors still in pajamas, her hair wild, clutching the dinosaur book Leo had started reading to her during his monthly visits. She skidded to a stop when she saw the garden, her eyes going wide. "What is this?" "Your library," Brian said simply. "Every person deserves a place to dream. This is yours." Sophie walked into the garden like it was holy ground, touching flowers, running her hands along benches carved from reclaimed wood, pausing at the greenhouse to peer through the glass at shelves already filled with books. "This is mine. Every word, every flower, every quiet corner. Yours." She spun, arms out, face tilted to the sun that hadn't forgotten how to shine. "This is the best thing anyone ever gave me." "Good, because you gave me my son back. This seems like a fair trade." Sophie stopped spinning, suddenly serious. "Is Leo coming today?" "Yes, and he's bringing someone." "Who?" "A surprise." Sophie's eyes narrowed with the suspicion children reserve for adults who know things they're not telling. "Good surprise or bad surprise?" "Good, I hope." The doorbell rang, and Sophie took off running, Brian and Carolyn following at a more dignified pace. Leo stood on the front step and next to him, woman in her 50s with kind eyes and Leo's smile. Brian's breath caught. "Hello, Brian," she said quietly. Maria, his ex-wife, Leo's mother, the woman he'd loved and lost because he'd chosen spreadsheets over sunsets. "I didn't know you were coming. Leo asked me to. He thought it was time." Maria's voice was careful but not cold. "I've been reading the letters too. He shares them with me. The ones about the divorce, about your regrets. I wanted to see if the man who wrote those words was real or just another version of the man who left." Brian looked at his son, at this young man who'd inherited his mother's wisdom and somehow avoided his father's mistakes. "Thank you for bringing her." "Don't thank me yet," Leo said, but he was almost smiling. "Mom has questions." They moved to the garden, this blended family of broken pieces learning to fit together. Sophie immediately claimed Leo, dragging him to see every flower, every bench, talking so fast her words tumbled over each other. Carolyn tactfully retreated to make tea, giving Brian and Maria the space they hadn't had in 18 years. "It's beautiful," Maria said, gesturing to the garden. "You built this for that little girl?" She was reading in a coat closet by flashlight. "She deserved better." "We all deserved better, Brian. But we got what we got." Maria sat on one of the benches, patted the space beside her. Brian sat, feeling like he was 17 again, nervous and hopeful and terrified. Leo says you've changed, that you quit your company, gave away your fortune, bought a diner. He says you're trying to be better. I am better, but I'm not trying to be who I was before everything went wrong. That person didn't know what mattered. I'm trying to be someone new. Maria studied him with the gaze of someone who'd once loved him enough to marry him and then hurt enough to leave. The letters are painful to read, especially the early ones. All that regret, all that awareness of what you were losing while you were losing it. Why didn't you fight for us, Brian? Why did you let us go? The question he'd been avoiding for 14 years, asked in a garden built from remorse. Because I thought you were better off without me. I saw my father and myself, the leaving, the distance, and I thought if I stepped back, I'd do less damage. I was wrong. Absence isn't neutral. It's its own kind of violence. Yes, it is. Maria's eyes were wet. Do you know how many times Leo asked where you were? How many school plays, soccer games, birthdays he looked for you? How many times I had to explain that Daddy loved him but loved work more? I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't give him back his childhood. Sorry doesn't erase the years. I know. They sat in silence, the weight of all the years between them settling like dust. Then Sophie's laughter rang out, pure and unself-conscious, and they both turned to watch her and Leo examining a butterfly that had landed on a rosebush. He's good with her, Maria observed. He's a teacher. He's good with all kids, despite having me as a father. Because he had me as a mother, Maria corrected, but gently. And because he chose to be different than you. That's his victory, not your failure. She paused. But Brian, these letters, this change, this garden, it matters. Not because it erases the past, but because it's proof that people can grow. Leo sees that. I see it too. Does that mean you forgive me? Maria laughed, short and sad. No, forgiveness isn't something you earn or that I grant. It's something that happens slowly in moments, like this one, watching our son smile in a garden you built for a little girl who needed kindness. That's a moment. We need a lot more of them before forgiveness arrives. But it's a start. Carolyn emerged with tea and cookies, Sophie trailing behind her making plans for a fairy garden in the corner of the greenhouse. Leo joined them, settling next to his mother with the ease of someone who'd been raised by steady love instead of sporadic attention. This is weird, Sophie announced, looking around at the assembled adults. But good weird, like when you put peanut butter on a burger and it shouldn't work, but it does. Did you just compare us to peanut butter burgers? Leo asked. Yes, Mom, Brian, and me are the burger. You and your mom are the peanut butter. Separate you're normal, together you're weird, but also kind of great. I have no response to that, Maria said, but she was smiling. They spent the afternoon in the garden, the awkwardness gradually softening into something tentative and real. Leo and Brian talked about books, a safe topic that led to less safe ones. Teaching, purpose, what makes a life worthwhile. Maria and Carolyn discovered they'd both worked multiple jobs while raising children alone, bonding over the particular exhaustion of single motherhood and the quiet victories of keeping kids fed and hopeful. Sophie flitted between groups like a bee pollinating conversations, asking questions no one else would dare. Do you still love each other? To Brian and Maria, and are you going to marry my mom? To Brian, and can I call you Grandma? To Maria, who'd said yes immediately, surprising everyone including herself. As the sun started to set, painting the garden in gold and amber, Leo stood to leave. Same time next month? Actually, Brian said, I was hoping for something more frequent. Maybe dinner? Once a week? Here or at your place or anywhere you're comfortable. I know I don't have the right to ask for more time, but I'm asking anyway. Leo glanced at his mother, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then he nodded. Okay, once a week. But I get to leave whenever I want. No guilt. Deal. And you keep sending the letters. I'm only on number 47. There are hundreds more. I will. And one more thing. Leo's expression turned serious. You have to let me in. Actually in. Not the polished version, not the reformed billionaire trying to prove he's changed. The messy parts. The parts you're ashamed of. If we're doing this, we do it honestly or not at all. Brian felt something crack in his chest. Not breaking but opening. I can do that. It won't be pretty. Family never is. Leo held out his hand, and Brian shook it, feeling the strength in his son's grip, the man he'd become despite and not because of his father. Maria hugged Brian before leaving, a brief embrace that felt like benediction. Keep building gardens, Brian. Literal and metaphorical. It suits you better than boardrooms ever did. When they were gone, when Sophie had been tucked into bed exhausted from joy, Brian and Carolyn sat in the garden under stars just beginning to appear. You've built something remarkable here, Carolyn said. Not just the garden. All of it. The life. We've built it. You, Sophie, even Leo and Maria. I couldn't have done this alone. You're not alone anymore. That's the point. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of a garden coming alive. Carolyn, Brian said eventually. Sophie asked earlier if I was going to marry you. She asks everyone everything. It's her superpower. What did you tell her? I told her that grown-ups don't rush into things, and that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose, not the ones you marry into. She lifted her head, looked at him. Why? Are you proposing? No, not yet. Maybe not ever. I don't know what this is, what we are, but I know it matters. I know that when I think about the future, you and Sophie are in it. However that looks, whatever form it takes. That's enough for me, Carolyn said softly. I spent so long trying to survive that I forgot to imagine thriving. You've taught me how to do that. So however this evolves, whatever we become, I'm here. We're here. They sat until the stars outnumbered the streetlights, until the garden became a silhouette against the night sky, until the temperature dropped and Carolyn shivered and Brian gave her his jacket the way people do when they're building towards something worth keeping. Inside, Sophie dreamed of gardens that grew books instead of flowers. In Providence, Leo drafted his own letter to his father, the first one he'd written in 14 years. And across the city, in a modest apartment she'd rented after the tabloid attention died down, Maria looked at a photo of her son smiling in a garden and thought about forgiveness, and how it grows like spring bulbs. Invisible underground for years, then suddenly blooming when you least expect it. Brian stood in his library that night, looking at the remaining letters to Leo. He'd written 347. 47 had been sent. 300 remained. At one per month, that was 25 years of correspondence. 25 years of trying, of showing up, of proving that change wasn't a moment but a practice. He picked up letter 48, read the first line. Dear Leo, today I learned that building a garden is an act of faith. You dig holes in the ground and trust that something will grow. He sealed it, addressed it, set it aside to mail tomorrow. Then he pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began a new letter. Not to Leo, but to himself. A letter from the man he'd been to the man he was becoming, documenting the distance between them, charting the path from loneliness to love. Dear Brian, he wrote, you spent 40 years sitting in empty seats, convincing yourself that isolation was safety. Today you sat in a garden surrounded by people you love, and you weren't afraid. That's not redemption. That's revolution. Keep going. He folded the letter, placed it in the drawer where he kept Sophie's drawings and Carolyn's coffee-stained to-do lists and a photo of Leo laughing. Proof that joy was possible even in broken things. The most expensive seat in the world, he'd once believed, was the one where no one sits across from you. But he'd been wrong. The most expensive seat was the one you filled with people you loved and then lost because you forgot what mattered. And the most valuable seat? That was easy. It was any seat, cracked vinyl or designer leather, diner booth or garden bench, where someone chose to sit beside you and stay. Brian Carolan had spent 40 years chasing wealth and finding emptiness. Now he spent his days making coffee and planting flowers and learning the names of people who'd never appear on a Forbes list but who made the world worth inhabiting. He'd lost his company, his fortune, his reputation. He'd gained a son who might someday forgive him, a partner who saw his scars and loved him anyway, and a little girl who taught him that courage sometimes looks like mailing letters someone else is too afraid to send. He was 52 years old. For the first time in his life, he wasn't dining alone. He was home,